Gentlemen, welcome to the Nexa front lawn for this first session on the first day of the 2020 Jaipur Literature Festival in association with Nexa. This is a much anticipated session called Eat, Pray, Love to City of Girls. It is sponsored by the North India office of the US Embassy in New Delhi and is a Raising Women's Voices session. The session, of course, features Elizabeth Gilbert in conversation with Alexandra Pringle. And to introduce the writers to the stage, I'd like to invite Kenneth I. Juster, US Ambassador to India, to come and make the introductions.
Thank you very much. It is truly a pleasure to be here at the 13th edition of the Jaipur Literary Festival. As a diplomat, part of my job is to facilitate the exchange of ideas and to foster dialogue, to build greater understanding among people of different cultures, backgrounds, and beliefs. Artists, musicians, and writers have also long been a part of that effort. In my view, literature is one of the most effective forms of cultural diplomacy because it unlocks shared experiences that transcend our differences. Perhaps Joyce Carol Oates put it best when she wrote, "Reading is the sole means by which we slip involuntarily, often helplessly, into another's skin, another's voice, another's soul." In today's world of Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I believe that books are still the true and most powerful connector among people. The power of literature lies in its ability to reveal glimpses of ourselves in each other, to reveal our commonality and our humanity. Today's speaker, Elizabeth Gilbert, does this extremely well, whether in narrating her own story, Eat, Pray, Love, or that of Vivian in City of Girls, a young woman coming of age in New York in the 1940s. It is my pleasure this morning to have the opportunity to introduce Elizabeth Gilbert, as I said, the author of City of Girls, that was published last June, as well as Eat, Pray, Love, which partly describes her experiences and time in India. Ms. Gilbert is also the author of Stern Men, The Last American Man, Committed, The Signature of All Things, and Big Magic, Creative Living Beyond Fear. I am also pleased to be introducing our moderator, Alexandra Pringle, who is the Group Editor-in-Chief of Bloomsbury. She has worked with a variety of prominent authors over the years, including, of course, Elizabeth Gilbert. Ms. Pringle is a trustee of the charity Reprieve and an Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. She has been awarded honorary degrees of Doctor of Letters from Anglia, Ruskin University, and Warwick University. Ms. Pringle will begin the session by posing questions to Ms. Gilbert, and then it'll be opened up to the audience. Please note that while this session is sponsored by the United States Embassy as part of our series on raising women's voices, the speaker's views are all her own. So please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Gilbert and Alexandra Pringle. Thank you.
Good morning, Jaipur. It has only taken us 10 years to get Liz Gilbert here, and every year has been worth the waiting, hasn't it? So thrilling to have her here at last in India, which I think is one of the most special countries to her development, to her writing, and here we are together. Liz, welcome.
At long last. I just want to say it hasn't been for lack of trying.
No.
There were 3 attempts over the last 10 years for me to come, and on each occasion there was a cataclysmic event in my life or in my family, and I had to cancel at the last moment. And this year, I remember thinking, if it doesn't work this year, I just have to obey the universe and stop trying. So I'm really glad that it worked and that I get to be here. It was only meant to be now, apparently.
It was. So you've had a wonderful introduction to Liz's writing. My introduction to Liz Gilbert was actually reading The Last American Man. So I'm a publisher, as you know, and I read the manuscript and I thought, what an extraordinary writer this is, what a voice she has, how clever she is. But I also thought, how on earth can I publish this book in the UK? It's about a very wild and extraordinary American man. But it meant that when the manuscript of Eat, Pray, Love arrived in my office, I was immediately thrilled to take it home with me. I didn't give it to a reader, I just took it home. And like many millions of people around the world, I had the experience of sitting down, but it was a manuscript and not a book. And I will never forget that experience of reading Eat, Pray, Love. And what I think people don't talk about enough with this book is it's incredibly funny. It made me laugh so much. And it also made me cry. And I remember that at one point, the manuscript was wet, and I couldn't understand why. And it was when Liz is on the roof of the ashram in India, and she's talking to her husband there. And then when I went to see the film some years later, I wept at the same point. So I thought that we would just start around there, which is that Liz has always described herself as a seeker and a storyteller. And I thought we'd begin with the seeking part of your life. So, Liz, when did you see yourself first as a seeker? Was it before Eat, Pray, Love, or was it when you went on that journey?
It was shortly before Eat, Pray, Love. I think, like many of us, I was driven. I think some of us are called to the divine in a very organic and gentle way. I think others of us are driven there by suffering. That can't be resolved any other way. And when I went through a very severe 2-year-long depression around the occasion, the occasion of my first divorce, that was the most difficult thing I'd ever been through. I was fraught with shame. I had done everything that I had been told as a woman you are supposed to do in order to be a good woman. I had gotten married, I had gotten a house, I'd settled down, I was about to start having kids, and instead of having children, I had a nervous breakdown because I actually had chosen the wrong path. And as nice as that life looked on the outside, it didn't suit me remotely on the inside, and it made me physically, emotionally, and spiritually ill. And to the point where I had a choice to either leave or die. That's what it came down to. But leaving was not easy because it meant going against everything, my culture, my family, myself, my husband at the time. I was pushing against a lot of forces. And I came out of it with a tremendous amount of shame. And I think that the particular moment that you're referring to on the rooftop of the ashram was a moment where a friend of mine who I'd met in India at this ashram where I stayed for 4 months, who had seen me continue to suffer in shame, had finally sent me up there with a list of instructions of letting go. And I think so much of that book is about mercy, about the mercy that you have to find for yourself, for your own karmic predicament. And that's a lesson that I have to return to again and again and again. And it's difficult because we often come from merciless cultures that say that you cannot make a mistake. You cannot make a mismove. You will never be forgiven. And so that self-forgiveness was what really brought me to my knees, literally, to be broken and then to turn from that brokenness into a devotional practice.
And then after Eat, Pray, Love, of course, you wrote Committed, which was an exploration of marriage. This strange institution which some of us fall into more than once, fall into and fall out of. And did you see that as part of the seeking that you went through?
Well, yeah, I never wanted to get married again. I don't like it. I just don't like it. I've tried it, and I've given it my level best. I really have. And with the second marriage particularly, I was sort of pushed into it. And I don't say that as a victim. I say that my second husband, who I still love very dearly, but I still don't like being married, so that marriage ended as well. we had immigration problems in the United States, and the only way that I could safeguard his life, his business, and our relationship was for us to get married. And I had ambivalence is not a strong enough word. It was a recoiling of terror. I did not want to enter into that institution again, and the only way I could do it was to devote 2 years of my life to learning. I tend to feel like if I can learn about something, I won't be as frightened of it. So I spent an enormous amount of time learning everything I could about the history of marriage and finding a pathway into it that I was relatively comfortable with. But I still remain deeply uncomfortable with it, and not for nothing, may I say, because the sociological statistics on what marriage does to women, and I say to, not for, what marriage does to women are extremely depressing. I have very good reason to be alarmed. There is not a single level of sociological data at which a single woman does not outperform a married woman. Single women live longer, they're healthier, they're less likely to commit suicide, they're less likely to become addicts, they're less likely to be murdered, they have more wealth, they weigh less. It never ends. It never ends. So whenever I hear young women panicking that they're not, like, there's something wrong with me that I'm not going to get married, I just want to hand them a sheaf of sociological data and say, you will do so much better if you don't. And the thing about it that's so heartbreaking is that the reverse is exactly true for men. There's nothing a man can do better for his life than to get married to a woman. There's nothing, and it's an exact reverse. Married men live exactly as much longer as single women do. So it's like a woman gets married to a man, and they call it the marriage benefit imbalance. She gives him literally years off her life, years of her happiness. Married men are less likely to be depressed, less likely to be suicidal. They make more money. They rise hard in their careers. They're less likely to die in a car accident. They're less likely to... Every single thing is better for them, and the women pay it. And so it's really a direct exchange of female energy to benefit male energy. And the only way to have that not happen is if you both agree as a couple that you're going to push very, very hard against that. But it's not easy because everything is set up for us to do it that way. So anyway, I'm just saying, if you feel like you're a freak because you're not married, ladies, cool out. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And gentlemen, try to trick a woman into marrying you as soon as you can. It's the best thing that you can do for your life.
Well, that's going to give you all a lot to think about.
A lot of good conversations on the drive home.
And yes, and possibly the divorce statistics in this bit of India are going to go on the rise.
They tend to rise wherever I go. I'm sorry to say that does seem to be my legacy, for better or for worse.
So from there, I think this leads extremely well into Liz's next book. And that's the subject of creativity, and that is big magic. And I said to Liz just now that at breakfast today in my hotel, I was sitting with my copy of City of Girls, and the young woman sitting next to me, who is American, it turned out, said, "We're reading the same book. Are you enjoying it?" And I said, "Well, I have read it," and explained. And then she was loving it, but she said, "Oh, big magic. This is a book I read every year." She said, "When I first read it, everything made sense to me." And I thought that was the most extraordinary thing. And the thing about big magic is it's like, I wouldn't say a Bible, but more a manual for people. And the point about that is that you read that book and you feel that creativity is open to all of us. Did you set out with that?
Yes, I absolutely did. I have this one really lucky thing about my life, and I don't know why, but for some reason, my relationship with creativity has never been fraught with drama, trauma, chaos, and pain. It just hasn't. All my other relationships are, but my relationship to creativity is very simple. I love it, and I believe that it loves me in return. I serve it, and it serves me in return. I go into it with infinite trust. I believe that it wants to work through me, and I trust that, and I relax into it, and it shows me what to do, and I do it. It's a very simple relationship. And why I wanted to write Big Magic was to introduce the possibility that perhaps we don't have to abide by the cultural stereotypes that say that artistry is only made through suffering, pain, loss, and angst, and that you're not a serious artist unless you're dying for your work. I've never believed that that's necessary. I think that's a really modern idea. I think it's a European idea. I think it's a 19th century German romantic idea. I think it's a very male idea. I think it's a very narcissistic idea. I don't think that that's how most art in the history of the world was ever made. I think it was made by people who did it because it brought them great joy to do it. My personal definition, as I was saying to Alexandra earlier, of art is it's making something more beautiful than it needs to be. And why I think that this is available to everybody is that history has literally shown that it is. And the great example that I give of that is that I come from Scandinavian Lutheran Protestant farmers in northern Minnesota, the most pleasure-fearing people who have ever lived, the opposite of Italians, the people who are the most suspicious of joy, beauty, and lightness that you will ever encounter, the least frivolous people, the most pragmatic people, and even those people made art, and they made it more beautiful than it needed to be. My grandmother, who was on a Depression-era dairy farm in Minnesota in the 1930s, used to make quilts by hand that would make you weep if you saw how beautiful they were. And she needed the quilts for her children because it was cold, and she needed it because it was a good use of leftover material that you couldn't use for anything else. So there was a pragmatic reason, but there was no reason that these needed to be as exquisitely beautiful as they were. She did it because she couldn't help it. There's an impulse in us that wants to make something and wants to make it more beautiful than it needs to be, and that is our shared human experience, and it's our shared human inheritance. So when I see the elitism of art that says that you only get to do this if you have an MFA from a particular university, you only get to do this if you come from a background where you've been trained at a certain level, it's a lie. It's actually not true. It's our shared human encounter. All of your ancestors did it. All of my ancestors did it. And I actually do not believe that we can be emotionally or spiritually healthy without creating at some level.
So that book is written in 6 sections, and the titles of these are Courage, Enchantment, Permission, Persistence, Trust, and Divinity. But there is one other thing that I think is at the center of everything that you do, which I would include in Big Magic, and that is curiosity. So would you talk a bit about that?
Oh, sure. I'm going to give you my curiosity versus passion speech now that I love to give whenever some of you are nodding because you've heard it. But okay, so it starts like this. What if I told you that each one of you was born with one special gift that was given to you by God, and that your job in life is to uncover that one gift that is yours that nobody else has, and that is your task, and then you're supposed to manifest that into a passion that you should then share with the rest of the world, monetize, and it should change the world. No pressure. No pressure, but that is literally the message that you have all been raised with. Certainly in Western culture, that is the message. It is so viciously cruel, and it causes so much anxiety to people, this passion-driven idea that you're, and I know so many people who have tremendous passion anxiety, and they're like, if I had one, I would know, but I don't. And so I just want to take that away from you if it is causing you anxiety, as I know that it is causing you many. And I want to take the word passion and replace it with a more gentle, loving, and playful, and excessively available word, and that is curiosity. Curiosity is available every single day of your life. It's simple. Passion tells you that you have to shave your head and move to Nepal and quit your job and sell your belongings and find God or do something incredibly dramatic that also has to change the world. Curiosity doesn't ask that of you. It doesn't ask you to make the full impossible sacrifice. It just asks you every single day, what are you a tiny little bit interested in right now? And would you like to turn your head a quarter of an inch and look at it a little bit more closely? And that's all you have to do. And the really interesting artistic life, I think, is the one that is not driven by passion, but by the trail of breadcrumbs, birdseed, and little tiny clues that equal the curiosity-driven life. And the lovely thing about it is that your curiosity can say, I'm really interested in pottery, and I want to look into that. And you can take a pottery class for one day and be like, yeah, that's done. Not interested in that anymore. And without going into a shame spiral about how you don't know what your purpose is, you can just say you ticked that off the list of what curiosity wanted you to do that weekend, and now what will it be next week? And maybe by following the breadcrumbs of curiosity, you might be driven someday to your passion, or maybe not. You might just spend your entire life going from thing to thing to thing, experimenting with what's interesting to you in this moment, on this day, and at the end of the life, your whole life will look like one of those quilts that my grandmother made. And it will be incredibly beautiful, and it won't look like anybody else's, and that itself is a life that is worth living.
As I'm sure you all know, Liz is very, very big on social media, particularly Instagram. And I feel that that links in with all our curiosity because Liz gives so much of herself into these wonderful pictures and captions. And we are very curious because we learn so much. But what propels you into being so engaged?
I'm such a natural for social media. I have friends who are writers. Most writers became writers so that they would not have to deal with human beings, right? Like, truly, it's the typical nature of a writer is, I'd like to just go in a room now and shut the door. And if I want to communicate with you, I'm going to communicate with you through my work, but please don't make me have eye contact or go to a party. This is much more of what a typical writer's personality is. For many artists, that's what their personalities are. I always say that I have the soul of a very serious writer, but I have the personality of an airline hostess or an aerobics instructor. I actually really love engaging with people. If I wasn't a writer, I would be one of the women greeting you here, welcoming you, because that would make me really happy to get to know you and to get to meet you. It's how I am. And so I took to social media like a duck to water because it just gets to expand the circle of the number of people who I get to engage with and who I want to engage with. And I have authors, friends who say to me, should I be on Instagram? My publishers say that I should, and I'm like, no, if you hate it, no. Absolutely not. It will be hell for you. Don't do anything ever that you don't want to do. But if you like it, do it. And so what I've discovered is this amazing community of people, and if any of you do follow me on social media, thank you for being part of that tribe, because it's not just a one-way exchange of me dumping something on there and then checking to see how many likes I get, although I do. I also read the comments and engage because I'm fascinated by your lives, and my favorite thing is when people befriend each other in the comments section of my social media and then become friends with each other, because that, that's my airline stewardess dream, is that all of you will eventually end up connecting with one another. I think connection is the opposite of despair, and it's the antidote to a lot of depression. And in a world of increasing loneliness, if you can find it there in real, sincere conversation on social media, I think that can be as real and sincere as any interactions that we have.
And I'm very interested that I find on my social media that a very large proportion of my followers and friends are from India. And so I know that this as a continent, I think probably India is more active than anywhere else in the world. So I think that is to do with curiosity, don't you?
For sure, and I see you on there.
And being
great.
Friendly, too.
Very, very.
So on to Liz Gilbert as storyteller. So what made you a writer? Big question.
I think the only honest answer is you would have to say I don't know. Because there were other things that were available to me. Like I had 10 years of piano lessons. You could sit me down in front of a piano today, and I can do nothing. I can do nothing except count the keys. It was wasted on me. There were other things that I was introduced to that for some reason didn't land. It wasn't my destiny. So I think to a certain extent, a general way to say it is that it was my destiny. Specifically, I do have to say, my sister is also a writer. My sister is the young adult novelist Catherine Gilbert Murdoch, who's written 10 extraordinary books for young people. So it can't have been an accident that we both came out of the same house. We grew up on a small family farm in the middle of nowhere. We didn't have any neighbors who are our age. My parents didn't believe in any sort of media. My sister always says it was like we were fundamentalist Christians without the hope of redemption. there was no religious background to it, but they were very frugal. It was a very stark, in some ways, upbringing. We had to create our own worlds to live in. And my parents also didn't feel that entertaining us was their job. And the only time that my mother and father would not interrupt whatever we were doing and put us to work to do chores is if we were reading. It was something that they had tremendous respect for. And so very early on, my sister and I realized that books were the portal out. If you were reading, you were left alone, and you didn't have to go milk the goats or move the wood pile. You could actually just sit and be allowed to read. And so it's always been the place that I went to for joy. And my sister, who's 3 years older than me, has this Scheherazade-like imagination, and she would create these worlds that we would live in for days on end because we didn't have TV and we didn't have other people to play with. So she would take whatever she was reading in the books that she was reading that were more sophisticated than what I could get to because I was younger and I wasn't as good a reader as she was. And she would invent these worlds and we would play in them. So we would be cave twins who lived in the Paleolithic times, and we had a pet dinosaur, but the dinosaur had polio because she had just read a biography of FDR, right? So like whatever, she would pull in whatever we had and she would blend them into these worlds, and her worlds were so much better than the worlds that we were actually living into. And I think that that sense of wanting to be in that fantasy is probably what made me want to be a writer. And I wanted to imitate her, and she was a writer. We used to write books when we were kids, and we would bind them, and which I think a lot of kids do, but I don't think a lot of kids draw an author photo on the back with a quote from like Gore Vidal at the bottom of it, saying like New York Times bestseller. I mean, we looked at books and saw how they were made, and we replicated them perfectly. So I think it was destined that we both became authors.
Maybe publishers too. Yes, publishers really good. So I believe each of your books was written for one particular person. So would you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is my only advice to anybody who's a writer. If you don't know where to begin or if you are stuck, this is the best advice ever given to me, and it was given to me by my older sister. Never write anything unless you know exactly who you're speaking to. And that cannot be a demographic, or it will sound like your book was written to a demographic. It has to be a human being. And so every single one of my books, the most important decision that I make is, who am I telling this to? Who am I talking to? And it's always one person, and it's a different person for every book. I think that's part of the reason when people say that my books seem to have a wide range, it's because each one of them was directed to a different human being. Speaking directly to one person will bring out your natural human voice. Also, we speak differently to different people, right? So depending on who you choose, it's going to shape the way that the book feels. So when people say to me, this lovely thing that I love to hear people say, that Eat, Pray, Love, most of all, people say, I feel like you were speaking directly to me. It's because I was speaking directly to somebody. It happened that I was speaking to my friend Darcy, who had gone through a divorce at the same time as me, who was on her own spiritual journey, but who would never have been able to take the trip that I was on because she was a single mother with a 3-year-old child living in Brooklyn. So when I went on that journey, I decided that I was going to take Darcy with me in spirit, and that every single thing I did, I was going to tell her about, because I would want her to have this experience too. So when I sat down to write Eat, Pray, Love, the very first line of the original draft of Eat, Pray, Love is, Dear Darcy. And then it begins, and I tell her the story. Storytelling is an older art than writing. And I think one of the dangers of writing is that it puts the author into isolation away from their audience. So if you can get back the idea of, let's sit around the fire and I'm going to tell you about this adventure that we're having, it'll actually make your natural voice come out more easily.
So Liz's two most recent novels, The Signature of All Things and City of Girls, are both set in the past. Signature of All Things, if you haven't read it, I would just say please, please do. It's an astonishing novel, and it's about a 19th century female botanist who in fact discovers what Darwin discovers, but she's not recognized for it. And it is an extraordinary odyssey, and to read it is to go on an odyssey. And it must have required a great deal of research, as with City of Girls. So maybe talk a bit about research with you.
I love research, as you pronounce it, or as my people say, research. City of Girls for me was a celebration of a liberation. The most difficult book that I ever had to write, or will ever have to write, was the book that came after Eat, Pray, Love. Something had to come after Eat, Pray, Love. And it was not going to be easy, no matter what it was, because all of a sudden there were literally millions of people with their eyes on me, waiting for me to give them something great again. And I knew that I could never, I know to this day, I can never match what happened with Eat, Pray, Love. It was a phenomenon. And I'm not saying that in any sort of modest or self-deprecating way. It can't happen again. You know, that was insane, what that book did. And so to write a book in the aftermath of that was an enormous amount of pressure. And that book was committed, and it was very difficult to write. I've never had a harder time, because I felt like the eyes of the world were on me, and not necessarily lovingly either. I also felt that I had critics waiting with cricket bats around the corner for, like, you know, a lot of people really hated Eat, Pray, Love, and so there were people who were waiting to hate whatever I did next as well. So on the day that I published Committed, I felt like I threw it off the sled to the wolves. You know, I was just like, here you go, take it, destroy it, rip it to shreds. I'm done. It broke the spell. People got to have their feelings about it, and then we were finished, and I was free. And my celebration of that freedom afterwards was, what can I write now in this echoing sense of freedom with no expectations on me anymore that will be the most buck wild adventure that I could possibly go on? And so I decided, well, of course I have to write a massive 19th century epic about a virgin who spends her entire life studying moss, because who doesn't want to read that? You know, and so that's what I did. And it's a book that took me all over the world for research, because it's set all over the world. It begins in Philadelphia at the beginning of the 19th century. It goes to Tahiti. It begins earlier than that.
It begins in Kew Gardens.
It begins in Kew Gardens in London, and then it goes to the South Pacific along with Captain Cook, and then it settles in Philadelphia, and then it goes back to the South Pacific. It circumnavigates the entire world. Parts of it are set in South America. It lands ultimately in Europe, at a different botanical garden. And it was the most fun that I have ever had doing work. It felt so liberating. And I'll be very candid with you also. Another reason that I wanted to write such an enormous, ambitious book is that, frankly, one of the things that Eat, Pray, Love did, and I think it's really important to say this, is it made me financially independent. Very few women in the world get to be financially independent. Glancingly few female artists get to be financially independent. And with that freedom, I wanted to honor it by doing something really difficult and expensive. It took, to be able to travel around the world for 4 years, devoting myself to this research, meant that I didn't have to have a day job. I didn't have to have a patron. I got to have the money to do the work that I've always wanted to do. And I felt like the only way that I could honor all of those women who came before me and who exist in this moment, who do not have that kind of freedom of artistic expression, was to do the most difficult, challenging, ambitious work that I could possibly do, the kind of work that men have always been able to do. And so that was really what Signature of All Things was too. It was a celebration of, like, let's see what happens if you make a female artist financially independent and she can do really ambitious work.
And I think one of the interesting things that book did, I found it difficult as the publisher of Eat, Pray, Love, that in the UK it was a bit like pulling teeth, because in America the book immediately took fire and Americans opened their arms to the book. But I'm afraid in England there was a sort of sensation that maybe it was a book for American women, that it was a bit too woo-woo for the sort of navel-gazing, yoga-loving. I thought, well, excuse me, look at me. I've never done yoga in my life and never gazed at my navel, but I absolutely loved it. And it took a long time. And interestingly, it took off in India way before the UK. 2 years before
India.
The UK, it became #1 in India. And that gave me so much hope, I can't tell you. And then it finally came to the UK, but there were people who refused to read Eat, Pray, Love because they had this vision of what the book was and what Liz was as a writer. And then when we published Signature of All Things, it was like saying, sod you, look at this.
Wasn't that satisfying?
It was great. It was great. It was longlisted for the Women's Prize. It was shortlisted for the Wellcome Prize, which is an incredibly distinguished prize, which is around books around science, and it's very serious. And so the world, Britain, which is a very small world, had to sort of sit up and take notice. And I love that Liz is always so unexpected in what she does. And so then with the new novel, City of Girls, she did it to us once again. It was like, hello, what is this? And this is a book. It's set in New York of the 1940s. So she took us into this other world. And it's about these women who live in the shadows on the sort of seamier side of the street. They're not the women who wear white gloves and hats that you think of in the 1940s. They wear feathers and high heels. They're vigorous and slutty and funny and bawdy and joyous and incredibly promiscuous. Why did you want to write about them?
Who wouldn't? Several reasons. One is that I've always wanted to write a novel about a promiscuous woman whose life is not destroyed by her sexual adventures. This is a nearly impossible novel to find in the canon of Western civilization. The trope of the ruined woman, it actually makes for an extremely good story. A lot of operas are also based on the ruined woman. It's a very dramatic story. You would think from reading a lot of literature that a woman makes one mistake and it's Anna Karenina, right? Like, under the wheels of the train is the punishment for pleasure. How dare you? How dare you go against what society has in mind? How dare you have lust? How dare you have desire? And if you do, you had best poison yourself immediately or throw yourself under a train or at least have the decency to be driven out of polite society. A lot of these novels I love as a reader. They're some of the greatest novels of the canon of English language. But as a woman, it gets a little depressing to watch one suicide and murder after another for women who wanted nothing more than sensual pleasure. And so it's also, I feel like, not entirely accurate to the history of women. And the reason I can say this is I know, tell me where I'm wrong, but if it was true that every woman's life is destroyed by the terrible mistakes that she has made in regards to sex and love, there would barely be a woman left surviving on this earth at this point, right? Because we somehow do often manage to survive our terrible decision-making, our lust and our bad ideas. We're still here. And not only are we still here, but sometimes those bad ideas, those terrible mistakes, are the thing that forge us into really fascinating women, especially as we get older, so that you can look back on your life and be like, well, that was one kind of amazing catastrophe after another, but never would I be who I am without them. I wanted to write that story, and it was so important for me. Part of the reason that I said it in the past, in the 40s, was, one, I also wanted to point out promiscuous, wild women have been with us from the beginning of time. They were there in the 1950s, despite what culture would let you think. The greatest thing I got to do was to meet a lot of them. When I was doing research for this book, I got to spend time with showgirls who were in their 90s or even in their hundreds, who had lived the most unapologetically sensuous lives, including one woman who was 96 and had never been married. She was John Wayne's girlfriend for a while. She was a showgirl at the Swan Club in New York. She was an amazing, still stunning in her 90s, never had kids. Her family was still angry at her for living an unconventional life. They were still saying to her, you'll be sorry someday that you never had a family. She was 96. She's like, I'm waiting, but I'm not sorry yet. She was so amazing, and I said to her, her name was Norma Amigo, former showgirl, still living in the same apartment in New York she moved into in 1950, the most amazing woman. And I said, did you ever regret not getting married? And she said, and I won't use her actual language, but she said, honey, who wants to have sex with the same man for 65 years? She was so incredible. And when I spoke to her, that gave me the final permission to be able to write this book. That girl existed in 1950. She existed in 1850. She just came to New York this week. That girl has always existed, and society has never known what to do with her. She makes us extremely uncomfortable. We don't know where to put her in a box, and I wanted to write a book that celebrates her. I
just want to read out one of my favorite lines from the book, which is this. At some point in a woman's life, she just gets tired of being ashamed all the time. As she looks back on her life after that, she is free to become who she truly is. So shame.
Shame. Oh, God, it's the great killer. Shame is interesting. Shame and I have spent a lot of time together. We know each other very intimately, and it is brutal. It is a brutal sensation. And I'll tell you, if I can, a quick story that I think is one of the most elegant things that anybody's ever told me about shame. When I was taking care of my partner, Rhea, when she was dying of cancer, I was priding myself on being the best caregiver who ever lived. I knew I loved her more than anyone had ever loved her, and I knew that it was my job to be such a good caregiver while she was dying of cancer. Anybody who has ever taken care of a terminally ill patient knows that you are setting yourself up for disaster if you decide that you are going to be the best caregiver who ever lived. It will grind you down. It is a brutal thing to take care of a dying person who's dying for a very long time, and it ground me down. And there was one day many days where I was defeated by it. And a woman who was a friend of ours came into our home one day to help. And I could see that she was doing it so much better than me. That her touch was reassuring to Rhea, that she was, and I fell into a shame spiral because I thought, I'm supposed to be the Florence Nightingale here. I'm supposed to be the one, and I'm exhausted, and I'm resentful, and I'm at the end of myself, and here's this beautiful, patient angel who's walked into the home, who has usurped me, and I'm history's greatest monster because I can't do this anymore. And I fell into tears about it. And my friend, whose name was Ariel, she came and found me. I'd locked myself. Shame makes you lock yourself behind doors, by the way. That's how you can know that you're in shame. Makes you lock yourself behind doors because you cannot let anybody see you because you're so ashamed of yourself. And so she came into the room, and I told her, I'm just so ashamed because I have no patience, and I'm exhausted, and I'm doing a bad job, and I'm failing, and I'm making mistakes, and I'm getting the medication wrong, and I'm doing all of it wrong. And she said to me, shame is the mistaken notion that you have done something that causes you to not belong to the human family. And that you have to then go pull yourself away from the human family, lock yourself behind a door, and be in your shame because you don't belong with the human family anymore. She said, there's nothing that you are experiencing right now. There were a bunch of other people who were visiting that day. She said, there's nothing you're experiencing right now that every single person in that room has not felt. Your place of belonging is at the table with all of us, not in this room behind the locked door. Come and join the human family that you're part of. You're part of it not because of your perfection, but because of exactly these sorts of feelings. It's what binds all of us together. Come and be with us and come back into the light and out of the shadows of shame.
So City of Women was published right into the context of the Me Too movement. It was erupting at that time. And I think it's fascinating to look at it alongside that because it's a novel about female agency.
Yeah, that was another sort of, it was interesting. I was writing that book at the apex of the Me Too movement, and there was a lot of heat happening around it. And what I want to say about that is I am a vehement supporter of the Me Too movement. It is a long overdue and very needed expression of pent-up female rage. Tremendous change needs to continue to come from it. What I'm about to say is not but and, right? So I'm including the Me Too movement, and I just want to add this. I don't want the only conversation about female sexuality to be a conversation about consent. I don't want that to happen because that conversation creates, I think, a world where inadvertently it keeps females in a passive, in a passive role. The conversation about consent seems to indicate that here's how it works. A woman sits around waiting for a man to desire her. He comes to her, he asks her if he can have a thing, and she consents to either give it to him or not. What that takes away from us, if we have that be the only conversation, and consent is massively important, obviously. Sex without consent is a crime. But if that is the only conversation about sex, what is not being discussed is the also very real aspect of female desire, female longing, and those instances where a woman is more predator than prey, where a woman walks into a room, looks around and says, I want that, and I'm going to go get it now. I've had experiences like that. You've had experiences like that. Every woman I know has experiences like that. And this book is a celebration of the subtlety and the complexity of female sexual desire. Female sexual desire is also a force that the world has never known what to do with. Women ourselves often don't know what to do with it. It's discomforting. Sometimes it feels like it's in control of you more than you're in control of it. Female sexual desire is biological, it's dark, and by dark, I don't mean sinful, I mean ancient, pre-civilized, right? These are forces that can govern us that are very complicated. So I just wanted to make sure that we don't take that conversation off the table. This is a book about agency. It's also a book about women behaving badly. It's also a book about women doing things that they later regretted because it hurt people. Women are also capable of making decisions around sex and intimacy and desire that cause pain to other people. We are not only victims, we can also hurt other humans. I want it to make sure that in the conversation about male and female sexual desire, women are allowed to hold the entire big tent, meaning we also can cause harm, we also can make terrible decisions, we also can make actions based on, we can also lie, we do all sorts of things around sex that men also do. So I just want to make sure that all of that gets to remain in the conversation as we are also having a very important conversation about the crime and the human rights violation of sex without consent. Thank you.
I do have another question I want to ask you, but I think we should get questions from the floor, and then I might slip it in just at the end. So are there any questions? Just a few.
And I have to be, I'm a fascist about Q&A. It's here as my responsibility to take care of everyone who's held hostage in their seat, to plead with you that your question be a question, which is a short statement with a question mark at the end of it. Thank you.
Okay. You want to start?
Hi. So one of my favorite stories from you is Paint Your Rock Stories, which is the approach has to come from gratitude. How do you balance that with our human nature of always wanting more and a better thing for ourselves? And how do you balance that
About
thin
gratitude?
line? Yeah, how do you balance the thin line between gratitude for what you currently have and also at the same time wanting more things? And better things for
Right,
yourself?
exactly. How are you perfectly happy with what you already have, but also allowing yourself to want a whole lot more? Yeah, I get that. Look, I think there's gratitude is neurologically they're finding incredible things about what gratitude practices can do to you. It's astonishing how a simple practice of gratitude, of writing down 3 things a day that you are grateful for, is actually shown to be as good a combat against depression as any medication that is currently out there. This is the newest, latest science on it. So it does seem to be clear that there is no happiness without gratitude. I think the difference is, if you can have aspirational desire but then somehow disconnect yourself from the outcome, I think that those 2 things can live together. I think that where you get in trouble is when you start wanting things, clinging to them, and deciding that you will not be happy unless you get your way. That doesn't seem to lead to a happy life, no matter how many times I try to make it work. Thanks.
Good afternoon, ma'am. You know, okay. You are talking about women's desire, and she should not be ashamed of it, rather. And in this age, you are still talking about that. Such a concept was Eastern, like with the part of which I live. But in the Western society, is still the same view.
I'm having a terrible time understanding you because I think it might be the speakers. Could somebody help me?
My question is, you are telling women not to be ashamed of their desire or sexual desire in this age.
Yes.
So there's still, that taboos are still there.
Yes, yes. I know, it's amazing, and I think I might have to repeat it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, because I think we're far from it.
So, it was something Eastern concept of Indian concept, like Indian woman has to be very submissive, not tell this thing.
Yeah, yeah. Not just Indian women. You'd be shocked how many women in the West with advanced degrees from Ivy League universities also have to be told not to be ashamed of their sexual desires. The rot runs deep on that. But thank you. I'm sorry I wasn't able to hear you earlier.
Hi, my name is Shivani, and I'm actually from the US studying in India, studying Hindi right now. My
Nice to
question
meet you.
was that a lot of the times when you talk about your work and how personal it is to you, how do you draw the balance of creating that personal relationship, but also letting that work go and not necessarily having that attachment to the end product that you create in your books?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you this. It's like, I'll give you an example from Eat, Pray, Love. When I wrote Eat, Pray, Love and people said, this is so intimate, you're sharing such personal things, I didn't publish my diary. What I published was a very curated 300-page book where I had carefully chosen what to tell you and what to show you. And I didn't even publish the first draft of Eat, Pray, Love. A lot of times people, if anybody out there is writing a memoir and you're struggling with the question of what you're allowed to put in there, what will people think of it, what will my family say, is it safe to say this? My advice to you is that the first draft of your book should have absolutely everything in it. Write the first draft as though nobody is ever going to read it. There is a very big difference between the book that you must write, because it has to come out of you and it's got to be poured out onto the page, and the book that you can publish. And the book that you must write and the book that you then can publish might be two very different books. For instance, as much as Eat, Pray, Love is, I think, probably the most famous divorce memoir of all time, how much does anybody in this room know about my first husband, having read it? Do you know his name? Do you know what we were arguing about? Do you know, did I put any details in there about him? And this is astonishing to people when they realize it. There's nothing. They had to invent a character for him for the movie because he barely exists on that page. He was in the first draft. He was in the first draft with a lot of rage and a lot of dirty laundry and a lot of anger. And then when I realized, like, does the world need this? Does the book need this? I needed to get this out. I'm going to take this off for many reasons. I didn't want to be sued by him. I didn't want to tangle with him. And I also just thought, does anyone really care? Does anyone really care what we were fighting about? And the answer is no. And it's my story. It's not his. It doesn't really matter. And so it's a question of how you get to curate it, you get to focus on it, you get to sand it down, and by the time you put it into public, there's never been anything that I've put into public that I regretted later, because it takes a long process to get it to that point.
What's the next question?
Yes, please. My name is Intisar. I'm also an author. I'm very happy for your...
I see you. Okay.
Hello. Yes. I'm very happy for your success because you seem like a nice person, and nice people with money these days seem to be a rarity.
Thank you. May I say you also seem like a nice person.
But
that's just because you told me I was, and now I love you.
I love you too, and you're very tasteful and perceptive.
You are also very tasteful and perceptive.
Shall we go on?
To be able to discern that about me. Let's just keep this going for the rest of time.
I love what you're wearing.
Thank you. Next question. This is my favorite question I've ever had. No, go ahead.
My question to you is, as an author, how did you decide when your book was finally ready to send to an agent? Like, when was the editing process for you finished? And were you still hesitant before you sent it out?
I don't do that. I don't overwork it. For me, it's finished when I'm sick of it. And it's finished when I've done what I think is basically, I'm a pretty who was it? Stone. Who's the novelist whose last name is Irving Stone? Maybe said he was the worst combination of characteristics in a writer because he was lazy and a perfectionist. I'm the opposite. I'm a really disciplined half-ass. So I work really hard, and then I'm like, it's good enough. You know, I'm not going to kill myself over this. The other thing that usually makes me want to get it finished is that I often have another idea coming that I really want to devote myself to, and the only way that's ever going to happen is if I let this one go. So it just comes to be a moment where I'm like, I've had enough of this. I don't really care anymore. And lots of times in reviews, people will notice that. And they'll say, like, there's something sloppy here, there's something lazy there, and I'm like, busted. Yeah, but you know what? I didn't want to just write one book for the rest of my life. I wanted to write many. So I'm very willing to let it go out of my hands just so that I can have my life back and do something else. Thanks.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Hello. Okay. Hello. My question is about the women characters in your two books, Signature of All Things and City of Girls, about how Alma Vivian are very different, but they're both sort of discovering their sexuality. So I wanted to ask you, what was it like getting to know these characters while you were writing them?
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm glad you... Hello? I'm glad you asked that about my two characters of the big books. Alma from The Signature of All Things and Vivian from City of Girls are both women discovering their sexuality. Alma's got a lot of limits on her. She's a 19th century upper-class woman. She doesn't have a partner, so she has to do all of her fantasizing and all of her sexualizing alone. One of the other reasons, and I'm so glad you gave me a chance to say this, that I wanted to write City of Girls is that so many people who read Signature of All Things said it broke their heart that she never got to have sex. And I just thought, I want to get the corset off and just have some characters who finally get to have sex as a way of honoring Alma. But yeah, I loved both of these characters so much. And I'll give you another piece of advice for anybody who's writing sex scenes. When I was writing The Signature of All Things and I got to, Alma has a self-pleasuring ritual, to put it politely, that she does because she's a very sexual, very sensual being who has no outlet for it. And when I got to the beginning of writing that scenes, I got panicked about whether it was actually okay, whether it would be demeaning to her. I didn't want to have her do anything that would demean her. I had such respect for her. So I called a friend of mine who writes romance novels and has written thousands of sex scenes in her life. And I said, what advice do you, and she writes period romance novels, bodice rippers, you know? So I said, give me some sex scene advice for writing about sex scenes in the past. And she said, it's the same as writing about it in the contemporary world. Writing sex scenes is extremely simple. All you have to do is allow the character to do whatever she would actually do. That's it. Just let her do whatever you know her. You know her. What would she actually do? Let her do it. That's it. And it's the best advice, and it got me through all the sex scenes in City of Girls too. Like, what would Vivian actually do in exactly this moment? And then allow that, just to get out of the way and allow it to happen. Thank you.
Okay, and then just one very quick one, which I just, because I want to know this very much. So, City of Girls is the most joyous novel, I mean, one of the most joyous novels I have ever read, but you wrote it at a time of enormous grief in your life. How on earth did you do that?
Yeah, I started writing City of Girls 2 months after my partner died. It saved my life. I had been researching the book for years, and then she got sick, and I set the book aside for 18 months to take care of her through her death. It was a way for me to rebalance literally the forces of darkness and light. I had been in such a dark time. She had such a horrible death. It was beyond even just the cancer. There were other factors during that time that caused it to be a very horrible experience for her, for me, for her family. Everything about it was awful. There was a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. And when you come out of a time like that, I think one instinct is that I could have done is I could have just sat down and written all about that terrible dark time. But what I would have just done is gone back into it and repeated it all over again. And that felt like it would be torturous for me to do. And instead, I decided to write the lightest, happiest, most sensuous, most fun, most joyful, exuberant book that would go down like a tray of champagne cocktails as a way of bringing myself back into life after that point. And it actually did completely, it was the yin and the yang. It just re-established and brought myself back to level, and I don't know what I would have done without it.
So thank you, Liz. Thanks,
you
for all your joy. Thank you for your wisdom. And thank you for coming to Jaipur.
Thanks, Alexandra, for bringing me. Thank you, everybody.
Once again, please join me in thanking Elizabeth Gilbert for coming to India, for making it this time, and Alexandra Pringle for that wonderful first session. The session was sponsored by the North India office of the US Embassy in New Delhi. And I hate to be the source of great disappointment, but unfortunately, Elizabeth Gilbert will not be signing books post this session. The next session here at the Nexa front lawn is Akbar and Dara with Supriya Gandhi Mani Mugdha Sharma, and they're appearing in conversation with William Dalrymple. That session will be presented by the Murthy Classical Library of India of Harvard University Press. Now, if you're looking at the program booklet, you may find a different session listed there that is, in fact, an old version of the schedule. So if you're looking for the session Panga with Kangna Ranaut, unfortunately, that session is not going to be held here. If it's going to be replaced in a different venue, I'll let you know. I'm trying to find out about that at the moment. But the session going on here next is Akbar and Dara with Supriya Gandhi, Mani Mugdha Sharma, and William Dalrymple, starting in 15 minutes.